welcome. It's our last couture discussion and we're going to be doing a roundup of all our favourite shows and just contextualising this couture season within the span of couture as a whole. So we have some amazing sort of historical discussion to be had with an amazing set of panellists who will introduce themselves. They look really sheepish.
My name's Alex Fiore. I'm the editor of Love magazine.
I'm Kim Howells. I'm a stylist and consultant.
And I'm Pat Frost. I'm the head of fashion at Christie's.
So I wanted to kind of pounce on you, Pat, first, because one thing that's always exciting to talk about with couture is obviously the history and the heritage, because that's what makes couture so exciting. So this is a huge question, but can you give us a little bit of the history of kind of couture and what you're particularly excited by in terms of
Well, I think
couture?
it's the same now as it was in, whenever it was, 1870s when Charles Worth started it. It's got to be eye-catching, it can't be worthy but dull, and it's got to stop you in your tracks and you want to know exactly where that dress came from. And presumably how it was made. So I don't think that changes.
You think it's the same?
Yeah.
So what's been stopping us in our tracks this season, and what have you guys been impressed with? Anything?
Well, I guess two shows yesterday stopped me in my tracks for different reasons. I think Jean-Paul Gaultier would stop anyone in their tracks, with small children pouring out from under wedding dresses.
That was amazing.
I mean, there was sort of some great stuff in Gaultier actually, but as with a lot of the times with his shows, I think some of it just got completely swamped by the sort of vaudeville of the show. I mean, I always find it quite interesting that he shows in an old kind of burlesque theatre in Paris, and there's kind of a feeling of it's a little bit bad taste generally, sort of what he does. But the opposite end of the spectrum was Valentino.
Yeah.
Which I read this morning that one of the workers in the atelier got carpal tunnel syndrome from making some of those clothes, which I thought was fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you so
You
much.
thought it was fantastic?
Yeah, no, I just,
You're like, I clap that solidly.
yeah, no, I love that kind of thing. But with the
Thank you, Jake.
with the opening couple of looks, the sort of wrought iron effect, which they created with silk rouleau. It took 500 hours to make the rouleau to make the dresses, and yeah, that's what they got carpal tunnel doing.
Wow.
And they said something else. I just thought it was very, very cleverly done technically and also thematically. They said it was the idea of a garden because you see a garden and it's beautiful, and you never understand the sort of sweat of the gardeners behind the creation of it. And they felt that was a very fair analogy with haute couture. And so they wrote down in the programme exactly how long it took to make everything in terms of man hours.
Wow.
Which I think is great, and it's sort of the one thing with haute couture that the one thing haute couture has as an advantage over ready-to-wear, even when ready-to-wear is pushing its kind of its extravagance and its expense, is the idea that in a ready-to-wear suit and an haute couture suit, they might say that they take the same amount of time, but in ready-to-wear it will be idling on a bench in a factory, whereas in haute couture they're talking concentrated man hours to create something. And that was really sort of what they emphasised without it weighing the collection down. I thought that was very clever.
Were you impressed with Valentino as well? Was that one of your
Yeah, I
stand
mean, it's
ups?
always the same with couture, kind of the craftsmanship that goes into every piece is what interests me the most with couture. So I think definitely the work that went into this collection.
I think this was perhaps the collection where the work was most obvious as
Yeah.
well.
Because some details is difficult to see from, images, but you can see from looking at the detail section and everything, all the hard work that goes into it with the beading and all the appliques. But definitely with this, it's quite apparent from the images as well, which is really nice to see.
Because Pat, you must have worked a lot with sort of vintage couture pieces. And is that workmanship evident? When you're going through them and you're looking at them and you're touching them. What are some of the most extravagant pieces you've seen?
Well, I think actually one of the most extravagant is McQueen, really, because when he got to Givenchy, he was like a man released.
Yeah.
I've got all these toys. I can do anything. I can shave a pony skin and make it look like lace. I mean, it's fantastic, isn't it?
I'm so glad you mentioned McQueen, because this idea of ready-to-wear designers who do couture-esque pieces is something we've talked about a lot, and where the future of couture lies, because you are seeing houses like McQueen doing pieces, that are of a couture standard, and as you say, are more extravagant than some couture pieces. And I think I've asked you this already, but I'd like to sort of get your opinion on how the future of couture can sort of continue as Couture Week in Paris, when you've got designers who are already showing couture pieces on a ready-to-wear runway. Is that going to be the future, where we see that more and more, and then...
I mean, I think the interesting thing with McQueen, as Pat just said, is the fact that he ended up, I wouldn't say he trained, but he worked with ateliers like Givenchy. And I think that's impacted, looking at his work for his own label before, during and after his time at Givenchy, you can see that there was a huge change in terms of the embellishment, the handwork that he put into those clothes. It was spring 1999 when he did that amazing collection that was all about the arts and crafts movement, and was very much about embellishing his clothes. He did the hand-carved wooden legs, and I don't think that would have come out if it hadn't have come out of the Givenchy experience, because really that gave him, in the same way that his tailoring expertise came from Savile Row, that sort of that softer touch that you get with French couture and French couture tailoring versus English menswear tailoring, I think was very marked after his time at Givenchy. It's the same with John Galliano. His clothes were obsessed with couture. A lot of the ready-to-wear he created in the 90s was virtually couture. It had to be hand-fitted. So I think if we talk about couture dyeing, I don't think that would be accurate. And I think there are still designers who are trained in couture who then go on, people like Boucherer Jara, who go on to found their own couture houses, because there are certain techniques and certain kind of experts that are involved in couture that you just don't find anywhere else. I think it is still a breeding ground for creativity and fashion. That's my personal opinion. And however great ready-to-wear might be at kind of emulating that, a lot of them still turn to couture workshops to really embellish their clothes. When Mary Coutrance did that incredibly embroidered collection last autumn-winter, that was done through Lesage, because they were the only people that could really achieve what she wanted. And I think that's still the case. There are lots of ready-to-wear houses that collaborate with Lesage, with Le Marier, with these couture specialists. So it's all born out of couture. And I think that couture needs to be there to keep that going, really.
So would you say it's the craft element that's the most exciting? Because it was a really interesting point that was raised in this morning's discussion, where someone said that what's exciting when watching the couture shows is, the craft and the technique, but it's not actually the design. You don't get a shape or a new sort of avant-garde style, which I thought, I wasn't sure about completely, but I thought it was an interesting point to be made. And do you think that should couture just be, this is almost like a showcase of places like Lesage, this incredible craftsmanship, rather than pushing fashion?
I think it should be that mixed with, incredible silhouettes and shape, and kind of like pushing the ideas, because it's like you said with McQueen, you suddenly get the tools to, experiment and to have all of these, amazing facilities at your fingertips. So I think definitely you see it a lot through the craftsmanship, but personally for me, I really like it when you see it through the silhouette and the movement down the catwalk, and the way they've thought about and engineered that. That's really special.
You can get some absolutely horrid dresses that are fantastic quality, can't you? I mean, obviously, but that are overdone, but fabulous. And somewhere along that balancing act, you can either tip into terrible or fantastic.
So what tips it either way? Because you've seen your fair share.
I don't know.
Is it just something?
I think it's different for everybody, isn't it? It's different for every designer as well.
What's one of your favourite pieces that you've worked with at Christie's?
I'm trying to think. Well, I think the McQueen things that we looked at for Isabella Blow were just really amazing, eye-opening pieces, because they haven't really been out before, and I'd certainly as an auction house, we hadn't had them in the hands, You've seen pictures, and as you say, you don't get the real idea of what they look like. But then you also have things like Madeleine Vionnet dresses, which are just stunning. We had a dress that was flesh-coloured satin from the 20s, or crepe rather, and embroidered onto it, probably by Lesage, were these silver looped ribbons, which close up you think, oh, that's really nice. But when you put it on a person who's walking down some stairs towards you, it actually looks as if they're completely naked, except for the looped silver ribbons. You know, that's what I mean. That's pushed into something else other than just embroidering a nice dress.
When you see the modern pieces come in, do you really get a sense of the kind of the common threads that have stayed through from common threads? I didn't mean that as an awful pun, but it is an awful pun. That have stayed through from sort of the early couture. So do you see, is it very recognisable to say that's the influence of wear, that's the influence of
Well, I mean, it is for me, but that's because I kind of look at it from that angle. But I'm sure a lot of people looking at the catwalks have no idea what the references are, in the same way that people looking at films might not know what's being a quote from a Truffaut or something. So the more you know, the more interesting it is.
Yeah. I guess what I'm getting at is kind of what's stuck in couture, you know, from right through from Worth till now. What do you guys think are the kind of the codes of couture, if you were, other than, you know, obviously like the craftsmanship? Is it particular?
Well, I think materials, choice of materials, as well as the craftsmanship.
What do you look for in a couture collection? What do you look at? Say that's couture. That's made it amazing.
I mean, for me, the odd thing about couture is that I do think it's evolved, and I do think it's changed quite recently. If you look at couture in the 80s, and I think couture in the 80s was much more about dressing people, whereas couture today isn't. Couture today is much more about set dressing, which it seems sort of a cliched thing to say, but I really think in the 90s there was this massive, when McQueen went to Givenchy and Galliano went to Dior, there was this shift that it became an enormous PR exercise. I think it was Pierre Berger, it was Giametti from Valentino, who was asked about the cost of the couture show, and he was like, it doesn't matter, it's our advertising budget. And that's how they viewed the couture, as a way of kind of projecting the brand name, and also this idea of excellence and craftsmanship, and creating something really, really exquisite that then people would associate with the house, and would then obviously do this kind of spin-off of selling perfume and lipsticks, and it sounds very trite and cliched, I think, because we've been hearing it for so long. And also I'm not sure how directly it correlates, but certainly I'm also not sure how directly it correlates between a kind of an advertising billboard and people physically going out and buying what it's advertising. But I think when you look back at kind of the 40s and the 50s, which were, as the V&A said, it's this sort of golden age of couture, the difference between couture then and couture now was that then couture was pushing fashion forwards. Couture was the engine that was driving the changes in silhouettes, the changes in hemlines, which sound trite, but also changes in women's relationship with those garments, and therefore changes with women's relationship in society, I think. If you look at what Dior did in 1947, and as I've said before, this huge reaction for it and against it, and what it represented to people, it's very difficult to imagine a couture collection doing that now, because people would just dismiss it as irrelevant. And there is an argument, which, as I'm a staunch supporter of couture, I don't really like to say, but I do think for a large number of people couture is irrelevant, because these clothes are never going to translate into real life. But in the same way that you could argue that to a lot of people a symphony is irrelevant, or to a lot of people a great work of art is irrelevant in that sense, but as something that's kind of inspirational and incredibly creative, I think that's the importance. And that's where that's the common thread from Charles Frederick Worth to today, is this idea of it being kind of haute couture, high needlework, the highest point of fashion. But how people relate to that is,
I'm interested that you
open to
mentioned the 40s and 50s because we've actually got the golden age of couture book lurking over there. But it'd be nice to talk a little bit because obviously you with your encyclopedic fashion knowledge, but also with the incredible history, to talk a little bit about, I don't really know where to put this, I'm going to give it to you, to talk about some of the great designers of that age, and we can maybe go through and have a look at some people that are really fabulous.
We can really say.
There's a lot on this table. Who are your sort of standout couture stars from history?
Well, there are different ones to different decades. I suppose the big ticket numbers would be Madeleine Vionnet, there'd be Paul Poiret, there'd be Chanel from the 20s and 30s. We had a really lovely wardrobe of Lanvin end of last year that was just stunning. But that was also stunning because it had all the original 20s sketches next to it, so you get an idea of the time. But then there are little pockets of things that people are looking for, and they include things like the Russian collection from Yves Saint Laurent. They would include, certain collections of Gaultier, but not all of them, and the same with Dior. Not every Dior collection is what people want.
I'm interested that you mentioned V&A because we had this conversation, I think it was last time you were in, Alex, about kind of, the forgotten fashion stars. And I don't think that's fair completely to say of V&A because obviously the label's still around, but there are the sense that some of the, the great couturiers have kind of been eclipsed somewhat from fashion history. And we were talking about this with Charles James, but also I think V&A is
Charles James, definitely.
Yeah, and why do you think it is that they're forgotten? And does this tie into what Alex was saying about, the clothes, that argument that the clothes are irrelevant because they don't touch people's lives, and that's kind of...
Well, I think there's a bit of, it's fashion, so people, a couple of years ago were looking for tailored suits and Balenciaga went right up. A couple of years beforehand, everybody was wearing boho dresses and Ozzie Clark made a lot of money. So it's horses for courses, so there will be some things that will go up and down, and some things that will be, always interesting.
Have you noticed, is there because I'm always interested in, if particularly with vintage clothes auctions, if people, I go and buy to wear, but then I see lots of people who I'm assuming are buying to wear because they're buying a little tiny, they're a 6-foot man buying a tiny 19th century dress. But have you seen an increase in the number of people buying vintage couture actually to wear it?
I think it was a high point sort of 2-3 years ago, I think. And certainly as far as we were concerned, it was lots and lots of interest in 3-4 years ago, then it just went straight down. But at the same time, the sort of historical stuff that the institutions are buying went way up. So
that's really interesting.
There is a lot of interest on an academic level, really, partly because of things like the Met doing such good exhibitions, including the Queen, and people in high places realising that fashion actually does appeal to the masses, which, but they hadn't noticed before, that they could get people into their museums by having fashion exhibitions. So they've suddenly realised that is important.
That's actually probably been the biggest takeaway from these panel discussions. It's been said every single time with couture about the relationship between fashion and exhibiting, and how there's such a thirst for it, and there's such a popular thirst for fashion, and in a way that's been actually posed as an argument for couture's relevance, is that regardless of whether these clothes are worn, they will eventually be seen. Because we had Shona from Somerset House who's doing the Valentino, and I think that is an interesting argument. It goes to what you were saying about a symphony or a piece of art, because if you know that you can see this fashion, does that put it back into being relevant and exciting?
I mean, it's weird because there was always, in the 80s, there was a big argument by the rich American ladies buying couture that they bought it and then they donated it to a museum because it was a tax write-off, which is why there's lots of American museums with amazing collections of Lacroix and, and Karl Lagerfeld for Chanel. And I guess that an interesting thing I always thought about that was that it is very much part of what couture is about, which is this idea of showing off. I think maybe particularly that linked with 80s couture, which was very much about this exuberance, extravagance, about conspicuous wealth, and about conspicuous consumption as well. Whereas with earlier couture, it was more about, it was the thing that was driving fashion forwards. So I think there's an amazing opportunity to see those kind of historical dresses, but with modern couture, I guess the reason I question it is that it doesn't seem to be leading fashion as much. It's not, you wouldn't chart the radical change in fashion over the last 25 years through haute couture. I don't think you would use that to look at really groundbreaking fashion over the last 25 years.
Where would you go then?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I was talking about, it would probably be minimalism. It would be people like Helmut Lang, Nicolas Ghesquière at Balenciaga, probably McQueen and Galliano. But I think that the radical stuff they did was before they went to Dior and Givenchy. Although the very act of them going to those couture houses was radical in itself.
Yeah.
And I suspect that's because younger designers, I mean, I talk about Nicolas Ghesquière at Balenciaga, which is obviously a hugely established house, but when he started there, he was a very young designer, and it was sort of this weird, impoverished house that no one really looked at, that he then raised up from the dead into something.
That's
really,
a credit to him. That we can't even remember that time, you know, when it was.
Yeah.
I know, like kind of late 90s. So, whereas even in the sort of 80s, you could argue that there were, you know, for instance, there was Lacroix who started out in couture and really did something radical with the silhouette. Although it was, exactly. And that embellishment and that whole idea, I guess that whole idea of reviving couture in itself was sort of, and that did influence fashion, I think. Yeah. Even the reaction against it with minimalism, and then in the 90s with it kind of returning to this idea of craft.
Do you think maybe the designers aren't quite mad enough, and they're now looking for a career as well as wanting to design? Because, you know, you get the feeling that people like McQueen, Galliano would have done what they did, whether or not they were being paid.
Yeah, they just wanted to create those fantasies a bit more.
Driven people, aren't they?
It's weird, someone was actually, a designer was talking to me about being offered some backing and said they didn't take it, and they wish they had, and they said if it had been offered to McQueen and Galliano, they would have taken it straight away, and you know, even if it wasn't quite right, which was their reason for not doing it, they would have taken it and used it to kind of get where they needed to get.
As much as they could possibly in order to get where they wanted to go, rather than where the money wanted them to take.
But I think as well, I mean, I think it's that idea in the 70s of the real birth of ready-to-wear, and I just think as well it's much more achievable, and you can have someone like Vivienne Westwood, who's had no formal fashion training whatsoever, go and create something radical. Whereas through couture, you were expected to apprentice yourself. You know, Courrèges worked at Balenciaga. Courrèges did something revolutionary. He'd worked at Balenciaga for a decade before he went off and had his big revolution in his 30s. And I guess there's that as well. There is that youth thing of designers starting earlier and taking more risks because they're younger, and I don't want to say more naive, but maybe they're more stubborn and more headstrong and more into what they want to do. And that tends to happen now, I think, through ready-to-wear rather than haute couture, just because it's more achievable.
Yeah.
It's easier for you to buy a sewing machine and sew something together, some fabric together you bought on Berwick Street Market, then go to Asher and get a silk and assemble an atelier to put it together for you.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you're a younger designer, you know, taking risks, because we have seen that a little bit recently with people like Iris van Herpen, who I would really like to talk about, because she is, I think she's like 28 or 29.
Yeah, she's young.
Really young, and this was her 4th season showing, and she's showing, you know, just couture, and her pieces are, I think you would say, you know, really kind of exciting and different, and it's kind of...
She's had an interesting journey, Iris, starting in London with those small pieces and then seeing how it's progressed to Paris.
What did you guys think of this collection? Were you...
I thought it was really exceptional, and it's extraordinary what she's doing. But a point that I think I said to you and that I sort of have made before is it, would you really say it's couture? I mean, people interpret couture in such a very general
Yeah, that's
way.
interesting.
But if we're being very specific about it, which, as you know, I love to be, you know, does she have an atelier with flue and tailleur? Does she, you know, is she based in Paris? Is she endorsed by the Chambre Syndicale? She can show as part of Couture Week and get attention. It probably gets much more attention than if she showed in London or certainly during Paris Ready to Wear. But because you show in Couture Week, it doesn't mean it's haute couture.
Yeah, we've seen, you know, with the example we were talking about earlier of Russian designer Yuliana Sergenko, who also shows as part of couture. And, you know, there is, we were talking about this in the office actually the other day, whether this is kind of an interesting business model. You think, why aren't there more young designers who are going, actually, I'll probably get more press if I jump on this schedule than if I try and make my name on a patch ready to wear. But I'm intrigued by what you say, is it couture? Because do you think that's important, that people should have to stick by those rules, you know, of having sort of 12 employees? But do you think that's productive? I think
that's a really interesting point. It comes down to kind of like, it always seems to come down to like the workmanship that goes into it. Does it make it couture? But I think it's a really good point. Maybe the kind of designs they're creating suits that kind of catwalk or atmosphere a little bit more, but I don't know if it necessarily puts it down to that. I mean, Iris's pieces up close, like, they're exceptional. I mean, just the ideas and the way she executes things, the materials she uses, and I know from chatting with her and having long discussions is, you know, all the materials, they go through so many processes before they even start to be put together. Like you kind of, I commissioned her to make a special something for me, and it was like 3 months. You know, it's going to take 3 months, because she started breaking down exactly how each material is put together and all the techniques it goes through, and that was really, really fascinating. So, I mean, she's a personal favourite of mine, just because she's kept to it, and I think what she's creating is kind of quite unlike other things going on, which makes her interesting for me.
It's a different form of modernisation as well, because what she's doing, you know, it is these big show pieces, and we say, you know, it's a modern version of couture, but then on the other hand, another modern version of couture is when we're seeing, you know, more kind of relevant daywear type collections like Bouche Rajara that we talked about, and it's kind of like those two different angles. And is that what you'd rather see, you know, sort of more?
I mean, personally, I'm a stickler for rules. And we said, what has there been since Charles Frederick Worth? And there's been rules. It was, I don't think it was Charles, I think it was Gaston Worth, his son, that set up the Chambre Syndicale. And the whole idea of the Chambre Syndicale was to protect them against copyists, and also to protect against lots of people setting themselves up and calling themselves haute couturiers. And obviously later on it became incredibly powerful in the sort of, I would say probably from the 20s through to the 60s, which was when the Chambre Syndicale could have you arrested and thrown in prison if you copied couture. You know, you weren't allowed to draw couture, you weren't allowed to take pictures. You know, if you bought a couture dress, your dressmaker could copy it for you. If she copied it for anyone else, she would get put in prison. And it's this idea of protecting a French industry. And obviously now that doesn't happen. That's not the purpose of those rules anymore. But I think the rules are there now and are important because it's keeping certain traditions alive. You know, if there wasn't the rule that everything had to be made in Paris, then people would get things embroidered somewhere else cheaply, and the embroidery workshops in Paris would die because of that.
Yes, really would.
Which I think is, for me, these rules exist because they're a way of, you know, it's almost like you don't cross the road when there's a red man, you cross when there's a green man. If you cross when there's a red man, you're going to get run over. It's a bit like you obey these rules, because if you don't, then you know, couture it can't exist the way that it has. But then I also really like the idea of working within rules and those rules thrashing something great out of somebody. The fact you have to work in this way means that you really, has meant that people have pushed the techniques and stuff.
Yeah,
like
I was going to ask,
think.
who's done that really well? Who's worked within the confines of those rules? Because you think people like Jean-Paul Gaultier, they work within the rules but do something that is still very pioneering. I was wondering who you think's done that exceptionally.
I do think Gaultier has. I mean, when Gaultier first started doing couture, he showed it in silence because that was the way that couture was shown. And he's always said that he doesn't fight against rules, he fights against convention. Because it's... he doesn't fight against tradition, he fights against convention. For instance, it's a tradition that you line the sleeves of a jacket in silk that's slipperier than the rest of it, so your arms go in easier. Whereas the convention of a man's jacket buttoning to the right and the women's the opposite way, that's a convention. Which I thought was because it was the man getting the wallet out, but apparently it was because a man dressed himself and a woman was dressed. But Gaultier argued that that was a convention rather than a tradition, which is why his coat's always buttoned one way for men and for women. So I think the way Gaultier's played with the rules of couture, particularly when he first started creating haute couture, is very interesting. And he's also one of the few younger couturiers that was trained in haute couture. He was trained with Pierre Cardin.
Would you agree with that an element of what makes great couture is kind of a small piece of rule breaking?
Well, it's always interesting to see people literally pushing against the rules and either getting away with it or not. But I think certain people really respond very well to having some kind of a cage around them in which they can react against. But I think what you're saying about Gaultier is that the sleeve thing, that made sense to him because it's practical.
Yeah.
But somebody else might, like sticky sleeves. I don't know. It might be if you didn't want them to move, kind of thing. That might be another convention.
Yeah.
So I think the envelopes are different for different people, but it's always good to see people having a go, pushing them.
I think as well you could even talk about people going into established houses, things like what Karl Lagerfeld has done at Chanel is very much about there are these codes of Chanel that he can break and that he can push. And the same a little bit with Dior, that there are these house codes and it's about working with them and against them. And so I guess that's a type of rule, is new designers in an established house. And there's so many now that are... I mean, Gaultier is one of the few that designs under his own name. Most of the others are...
But do you think in a way there is a sort of a benefit to designing under another name because you get that incredible archive and that incredible sort of those codes, to work within? And as you just said, some people work well within being in a cage in that sense. And I wouldn't say that kind of the codes of Dior or Chanel are a cage, but to see someone like Raf streamline his vision to fit into this Dior mentality, that's really exciting.
I mean, I think sometimes it can be great, sometimes it can be dreadful. I mean, Claude Montana did Lanvin couture, and you think of Lanvin in fact you think of Lanvin then and you think of Lanvin today, and Claude Montana is not the person you would put in there. And it's weird as well, Lacroix going to Jean Patou, and really he just sort of completely disregarded what Jean Patou had ever done and did what he wanted to do. But again, these are sort of houses that people are, houses or twinnings of names that people don't really remember because they're not Karl Lagerfeld and Chanel. They weren't as successful as others.
What are the historical houses that there's the most kind of passion and enthusiasm for? Do you find that people are constantly excited by,
Well, there's lots of different reasons. I mean, if you're talking about vintage,
exactly.
Chanel is way up there. People will just buy Chanel all day long. But if you're talking about, something for a museum, then they're completely different names. So, I mean, there are two completely different markets for wearing and collecting. And there are people who do both, but they're completely different reasons.
What would you say the strongest ones for collecting?
For collecting is, you really want rareness, preferably something that other people haven't got. You need something that's got show appeal as well, because you're going to put it on a mannequin in a probably rather drafty hall somewhere. So there's all sorts of things, and also fashion as well, because sometimes you get all the ingredients and it doesn't add up. So, I mean, I think the Schiaparelli exhibition at the Met was one of those that didn't quite add up, despite, having an archive to die for.
There are elements of this. The Schiaparelli archive is not. Some of the pieces aren't preserved that well, are they?
No, she wasn't that interested in finishing off everything properly. But on the other hand, they're just magnificent things in their own right. And I suppose at some point we have to cross this and discuss this "is it art" line
we
somewhere.
stayed away from that
I
debate.
know.
I'm glad you brought it up because it is our roundup, so we can.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
We can do that.
Because I think certainly some of the Schiaparelli is definitely on the art side. I think people like Poiret definitely go that way, but obviously McQueen with the sculpture, those corsets, that's not a known haute couture workshop skill, welding. So yeah, there's lots of different things really that would make up that sort of thing.
What do you think triggered this kind of increased popular enthusiasm for fashion? Because from what you said before, it was implied that it was just kind of curators and museums hadn't realised, there was this popular enthusiasm. But do you think there was an element of people getting excited by designers like McQueen and actually getting people involved, or do you think
it was probably a bit before that, but before the press and the sort of general myth making business started? But things like the V&A's costume court stayed the same for decades. And it wasn't that they didn't want to change it in the department, it was that there was just no interest in funding that kind of change. And it does come down to money and budgets and things like that, which means committees and probably a lot of men in suits. But now, I think there are less men in suits on those committees, which helps, definitely. And it probably is. There's probably more men in suits in couture, paradoxically. And maybe they're meeting in the middle somewhere. I don't know. I think deals are done. You feature our designer, and we might sponsor something, which is fair enough, frankly. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But so I think we're talking money really, and where the money is. Yeah.
It goes back to the point you were making, Alex, about it all being kind of an element of just being PR and advertising.
But I think that maybe makes me sound very cynical, which I do quite a lot. Yeah. But it's actually not. I think the idea of maybe it is
money. It's
exactly.
Just,
but
it's be used well.
I would much rather that someone advertised by pumping money into making incredibly exceptional garments and creating something beautiful than some god-awful, TV campaign or something. Yeah. It feels much more relevant and exciting and interesting, and it's more what people want to see as well. I think there is also that argument with haute couture that people like to see fashion shows. They like to see fashion images. They like to see people wearing clothes. That's sort of where, on the flip side, why we now have 4 seasons instead of 2, because pre-collections have been bumped up into spectator fashion as well as the main spring, summer, autumn, winter shows. And I think one of the things that haute couture slots into that as well, it's another season for us to get excited about seeing. It's another season for people to get dressed up and go to Paris and see beautiful people wearing beautiful clothes. So I think that's one of the reasons why haute couture keeps going, because it's part of this fashion system, and it's not necessarily part of the fashion system that's producing clothes, but it's one that's producing images and producing publicity and producing hype, all of which in a very good way, and it does produce some incredible, exceptional clothes that will, if they're not pushing fashion forward, they will at least stand as kind of a testament as to the techniques that were possible. And you look at some of the techniques that were used, and there's no way you could replicate some of the techniques in V&A dresses or in some of Worth's pieces. Although one of the things that's not said about Worth very much is that they're quite shoddy a lot.
Yeah, but it was a factory, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I
It
mean,
was a factory.
which it bears to be said. I think the fact that, you know, if there was a ball, Worth would probably make everybody's dress for it in the 1860s. So he'd be making 200 dresses for a single night, and so a lot of it was tied together. And also, it's only going to be worn once, so it kind of didn't matter if it fell apart.
And he met people off the boat, you know, coming from the Dollar Princesses. You know. This is the way, off your liner, into my salon. You know, it was not. He wasn't shy.
He was a businessman at the start of it.
Businessman,
You know,
yes,
he worked in a department store at the start of it. I mean, I think another thing that's really interesting about those Americans buying Worth is that they used to keep it in a trunk in the attic. It was unseemly to wear that season.
You've been reading Edith Wharton.
Yes.
You read that bit. It was fantastic.
Just they used to lock it up and
say
then
that.
Was it? And I
They
can't
were
remember if
cross
it was
that their aunt had died.
See, I can't remember. I was going to say I couldn't remember if it was in Wharton or if it was in a history book where I read about about an aunt dying and they all went up and she had all of her works and they were all like, oh, we could wear them now because she'd had them sort of embalmed for a year, so they could wear them now that she'd died.
And these girls were cross because some aunt had died, which meant that the Worths that they brought back from London the year before, Paris the year before, they weren't going to ever be able to wear because by the time they came out of mourning they'd be too far out of fashion.
And that's so interesting because if you think when haute couture was tied to fashion seasons, you know, obviously it's still shown in seasons, but I think shoppers today, if you're buying a piece of couture, you know, you wouldn't think in 6 months' time we're not going to wear this. Or maybe the people that buy couture do think that. I'm not sure.
I think they probably do.
I think sometimes there's a bit. I mean, some of the ladies have talked about buying evening wear, and the idea that a piece of couture evening wear is eternal. Like you buy it, it's really well made. It's, you know, it's not going to change that much. Shoulder pads might get a bit smaller, but. Because I mean I find that whole mentality of buying couture really fascinating. There are some women that buy it and wear it once and then donate it to a museum. A lot of American clients do that, whereas others will buy the sample and will wear that forever and ever. And I guess another thing that's interesting is the fact that houses today, I was told that Chanel don't actually archive everything they create. They only archive pieces. And they didn't know who chose what pieces got archived, but they choose kind of different pieces from the show and they'll archive those. And I guess it must be if they use a specific technique that they've not used before, or a specific fabric, or there's something that marks it out, but they only archive some of them and they'll sell the other samples or give them away. But I mean, maybe also it's the volume of stuff because they have sort of
a lot, don't they? Yeah.
They have like a little network of warehouses out on the outskirts of Paris, like a little town, couture town, where they keep all of their stuff. So if anyone is listening and would like to send me to Chanel Couture Town, I'm more than willing to go.
Set up residence.
Yeah, but I think that's, but also there's the weird paradox of that is that they're trying to buy old examples from their archive that they don't have. You know. Which is a similar thing with a lot of fashion houses. I think you probably find that it's fashion houses trying to buy their own stuff from you.
I mean, it used to be the post of archivist in a fashion house used to be somebody sitting in a basement with a lot of paper. And certainly in the last 5 years, the numbers have increased a lot of people who are doing it, and their titles are getting very grand. And they're just much more active in looking for things to fill gaps in the archives, which is good.
Wasn't that a problem for McQueen at Givenchy? You know, he didn't have proper access to the archive.
They didn't have a great, and I think as well with, I mean, another interesting thing is the fact that when Galliano first went to Dior, it was obviously 40 years since the new look, and he couldn't look at many garments because they'd all been sent out to be exhibited, which again I guess links in with this idea of fashion houses kind of perpetuating, I don't want to say their own myth, but I guess their own legacy and the legend of, you know, the wonder that was by sending out their own archive to be exhibited to the public.
Yes. Well, I think there's only 2 bar suits that around, aren't there?
The V&A have one.
V&A have one, I think. Yes. I think there's one in America, but no, it's definitely something that they've belatedly realised that not only is it good to have an archive, but their designers can then drawn it. Because, I mean, there was a sort of myth going around that Guesquière wasn't allowed to look at the archive of Balenciaga until they thought he was ready.
I mean, I know that I used to know the designers that worked at V&A, and they weren't allowed to look at the V&A archive. They had to make an appointment to go and look at the archive of photographs of V&A, but they couldn't look at because and that's sort of France as well. It's a French national monument, the V&A archive. You can't just go and look at it. And yes, which I think as well for designers, it can lead to interesting things. Yeah. With Guesquière, he definitely said that he didn't draw on it until, I think it was about like 2006 was the first time he was like, this is a Balenciaga collection. And it was that whole idea of him kind of looking at the idea of the house and also what he wanted to do, I think, which is maybe why it was so influential, that he wasn't slavishly relying on archives or on picking archive pieces or something like that.
Talking of reinterpreting the archive, I know you've talked about this already, so I keep asking for more. But I would like to touch a little bit on kind of this season in particular, and obviously talk a bit again about Dior, because it was such an interesting collection. It's Raf's second couture collection, but it's kind of, he's now more sort of on the home run at Dior. You know, he's done a few seasons, and I was interested in, Kim, what did you think of the collection?
I particularly loved how he's kind of put these very casual pockets into such beautiful gowns. Like, I really, really enjoyed that, and especially when you see the dresses move and you see the models posed with their hands in their pockets. I just thought that was a really nice kind of mix, if you like. And I like kind of, I mean, I always like with the couture kind of like the fantasy that they sell us in terms of like the set and the hair and the makeup and like everything we're seeing. So with this, I thought the gloves were pretty incredible, weren't they? But I think for me the strongest thing was the pocket detail. I love that. There's one dress coming up
or down?
I think down. Sorry.
Down. Okay.
Like these petals. I love these petals. Like all the petals, and when the dresses are completely encased in them later on in the collection, it's so beautiful. And when they went on to the gloves, I loved the balance of everything. I really enjoy kind of like strong concepts, and when they continue the concept through to the material, through to the colours, like, and the whole thing's executed.
Oh, those are your gloves.
Yeah,
and the red.
Stephen Dones yesterday was telling us about the hats that he'd made, and oh my god,
the gloves.
They sound amazing.
And there's a look, it's all the whole floral and the gloves. It's my favourite.
Has there been a mood to this season, do you think, across the different collections? Has there been anything you've noticed?
Parallel lines.
I mean, I think it's a bit...
It's tricky with couture to do that.
I kind of think it's not the done things to talk about sort of trends across couture, because it's so, you know, there's 8 shows. And it's not really about bringing in a seasonal change, I don't think. There's been a lot of floral imagery, but it's spring. It's a bit like saying there's going to be a lot of coats in winter, because you know it's just a natural thing.
But I'm interested because you say, you know, it's not about trends, and I do agree with that. But then there is, as much as couture is seen as, you know, a pillar of tradition and years of sort of work and old houses, there's a ton of flux that goes on actually with the couture in terms of the schedule. You know, who's showing, like, who we've got now is very different to even what we had in sort of 2004, and you do see houses come and go and drop off, and I think that's why I ask about kind of a mood of the season, because you don't quite know where you're going to be in 2 or 3 years' time. Do you think that, do you find that kind of flux a bit worrying? You know, that you can see someone like Lacroix come and then go.
I mean, with Lacroix, as much as I always loved Lacroix, I question if it was always destined for failure. I mean, it didn't turn a profit in 25 years. It's kind of... I think what he did was extraordinary, and I think what he did at the couture was exceptional, and if it was 1950, it would have probably been very successful. But the trouble is that he never managed to translate the kind of incredible vision of the couture into ready-to-wear. and into perfume and into diffusion lines and into accessories. And really that's what it's about. If you want to support a business, doesn't mean you're a better or a worse designer. I guess it means it's a better or a worse business.
Maybe you need a Pierre Berger behind you somewhere.
Exactly. Or
Doing
even someone just designing the ready-to-wear for you. I think that with Lacroix, he never really had a ready-to-wear mindset. He was never really able to, to translate, to realise that there was a difference between couture and ready-to-wear. Or maybe the problem was that he did realise there was a difference, but just
wasn't interested.
But also just couldn't rationalise the two. I mean, it wasn't like Lacroix did incredibly embellished evening clothes for ready-to-wear.
I think that might be true because he did that exhibition at the Louvre, which was his exhibition, and he devoted an enormous amount of space to Mambrochet dresses. And you just think, well, you're just kind of weird because most designers would have just put their names out, and he didn't. So maybe he has that sort of split in him that means that he's not a good businessman or something, or never going to turn a profit. That doesn't necessarily mean.
I mean, and also, I mean, with some of the other houses, I think as well, there are houses, of course, that used to show couture and just stopped because because maybe they realised that it wasn't actually profitable as much as we argue about the publicity they get from it. You used to have Thierry Mugler doing haute couture. Ungaro used to do couture. Saint Laurent, obviously, with Michel Saint Laurent. But it is such a... I think what you need to have is the perfume and the makeup and the accessories to shore up the expense of it, to kind of justify the cost of it. Because for a lot of houses, seeing dwindling numbers of customers, which happened as ready-to-wear got more and more sophisticated and became the thing that was leading fashion, it became very difficult to justify the cost, not just the cost of the clothes, but the cost of staging the shows.
Yeah. So what do you all see as kind of the future of couture, whether it's in the clothes, whether it's in how it's presented, how it's received? Where are we
headed?
Yeah, where are we headed?
Gosh.
Big question again, but it is the Roundup, so I'm allowed to do this.
I don't know, I guess it depends whether the economy goes down the drain or not as well. Because people won't necessarily want to wear beautiful floral dresses if they feel rotten.
Yeah.
So that's going to help or hinder, one of the two. So
I guess the other thing to be factored in is that there's always these... I think there are these emerging markets, and there are so many of them that are incredibly wealthy. I know, for instance, I went to an Armani couture show a few years ago, and it was full of Chinese clients.
Yeah.
And Valentino recently were going to do a couture show in Brazil. They didn't end up doing it, but it's still in the cards for them to go and show the collection in Brazil to sell to Brazilian clients, which is sort of in the way that in the 70s you had the Americans, and in the 80s you had the Middle Eastern clients coming in, and in the 90s it was the Russians. And Ungaro went and showed his haute couture in Russia in 1996 to sell to the Russian clients. So I think it's odd now because it's, as opposed to immediately post-war when it was very much focused on these European, this European elite and these American elites as well, buying haute couture. Now there are all these new markets for people that want that kind of wealth. And also I guess if you have that amount of money, if money really is no object, why wouldn't you have the best stuff? Why wouldn't you have the finest workmanship? Why wouldn't you have people fawning over you to make you look the best you possibly can? And I guess that's the other thing about haute couture. It's going to be better because it's made for you. You're going to look better in it because it's going to iron out any imperfections in your body. That's what they've been trained for 150 years to do. So I think as long as there are people with the money for it, it will exist.
It's interesting that you mentioned these new markets, because we're launching a project on SHOWstudio tomorrow about this, where Marie Schuler, who's a filmmaker who works with us, she went to Singapore and looked at the Singapore sort of couture week, and there were designers that came, and there were designers from Asia that showed, but also French designers who went over and presented there. And it's a really interesting kind of project to look at, in the way maybe that is going to be the big change in couture. You know, it's actually geographically where they're showing, and the types of, the way in which it's presented and who it's aimed at, because this is an event that had a huge amount of buzz around it, but it's so outside of what Style.com covers and what we see as couture, when actually, you know, you had Alexis Mobile was there, you had French designers going and presenting, because they know this is where the thirst for what they're showing is, and the market for it. And do you think we could see a change where...
I mean, it changed in the 80s. One of the old stipulations of haute couture was that you had to allow your clients about 50 chances to view the collection a season. And then in the 80s they started to use videotape. So that that was originally, that was by doing shows every day, repeated shows every day. But when they started to get videotapes, they just used to be able to send tapes to people, and that they could, you know, the Middle Eastern clients particularly used to order it over the phone. And obviously, if they'd been measured at couture, then they would kind of have video tea parties, watch the couture collections, and then they'd all order over the phone together. So I don't think it's entirely unfeasible for those rules to be bent yet again, and for maybe couture to start being exported in that sort of way. Because I guess that it's sort of, as opposed to just exporting the dresses, you'd be exporting the glamour of the show.
Yeah.
It's something to draw a parallel with ready-to-wear. It's something Louis Vuitton have done a few times. They showed in Shanghai last year, and in 2006, I think they showed in Tokyo, and exactly replicated the Paris show with the same models and everything like that.
And it's not new. I mean, Dior was doing it in the 50s.
Oh, of course, because he came and did it here.
He came and did it here. He did it in South America. So did Yves Saint Laurent. They had special studios with Japanese. Givenchy had Japanese stores who made couture dresses for Japanese clients. I mean, it's not new. So I think it'll move around, but it might mean that you get a different colour palette for people from Asia.
And it's interesting because that affects the way I think often in which the fashion is received, because it's a point that Stephen Jones made yesterday when we were talking about the, I'm scared when I say her name, Yulana Starenko show, because he did the hats for it, and she's obviously a Russian designer, and she shows this very opulent Russian aesthetic. And he was talking about how it hasn't been particularly well received by that collection, by some of the critics, and particularly the sort of the Western critics. And he said, but you know, you see girls sitting in her front row who have come over from Russia, and they're wearing versions of what she's showing, and they will buy it, and they do like it, and it is relevant to their lives. And I think that is quite an interesting moment in couture, you know, how what we perceive as good and what we perceive as fashion, as opposed to what the people who actually buy the couture, where they're living, the climate they're living in, and the aesthetics that surround them, and what they want to buy. I think that's quite interesting to see. You know, is it even,
It's hard to say relevant to their lives when, you know, the lives of a couture client. I think an interesting thing about it for me is, generally speaking, when you see sort of couture clients being interviewed, I mean, there's not as many as there used to be, they would usually be married to somebody very rich, and their life would revolve around the couture, or at least part of their life would revolve around the couture, in a way that maybe ladies did in the 19th century. It's that idea of kind of what Veblen said, it's a leisure class, and it's this idea of expressing your wealth by wearing clothes that impede your movement. Or with couture, it's you know, clothes that are incredibly expensive and require a certain amount of your time to put them together.
But that's a pattern you see across fashion. So we had Susanna Franklin for one of our ready-to-wear panels, and she made a point about the kind of the more modest styles that are seen as very fashionable now. And she said, you know, part of the reason is, if you go to the 80s and 90s, the people who were buying fashion, it was boyfriends and husbands buying it for their girlfriends. So they bought things that showed off their figures. She was like, whereas now women could afford to buy the clothes themselves, so they buy things like Celine because they actually really like how it looks. And I thought it was
really
quite
interesting.
she was kind of being pithy when she said it, but you know, it is actually an interesting point about who buys who buys the trousers rather than, which is quite interesting.
Oh, well, I see that all the time. People bringing in things that their husband's boyfriends have bought them and they're just never ever going to wear.
Yeah. We've all been there, haven't we?
Yes, but I mean, and especially in things like accessories, like handbags. We get a constant stream of people with sort of pinks and yellows and things that have been picked up, and they say, I don't want pink, I want something else kind of thing. Sell that one and I'm going to buy the other. But without any kind of sentimental attachment. If my beloved brought me something that was, the price of a small house, I might hide it rather than go and flog it.
Sell it.
But they're anonymous in that way because they're units, they're not.
I mean, I think as well there's something great that sort of links in with that, which is the idea of couture allowing customization, which the ready-to-wear has obviously picked up on. The idea that the client dictates. And really I'm doing this as a roundabout way to tell my favourite couture story, which was
really good.
I think it was Dior in the 50s had a gentleman that came in and ordered clothes for his wife, and he said, can you go round and fit them on her? Ordered kind of 5 or 6 really extravagant dresses. They went round and they fitted on his wife, who was very small and very blonde. And then at one point the wig fell off and they realised it was him. And he'd ordered the dresses for himself and had them, take around, and then they realised it was him.
That's really lovely.
Which I love. And that actually links with Charles James, who modelled dresses for, I think it was Bonwit Teller, and he decided the model that he employed wasn't good enough to model his dresses, and he modelled them himself. And they were so good, the guy from Bonwit Teller bought the dresses.
That's a lovely, very anecdotal way to end, I think, with a fashion story from Alex.
Weird fashion story from Mike.
Well, it's meant to be fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be magical. Thank you so much. Usually we do a round of applause, but we didn't actually watch a show, so I will just say thank you to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.